Hello, friends. Greg Koukl here on Stand to Reason, back for our final hour with J.P. Moreland. And we are discussing his most recent book, The Soul, and I'm looking for it right now because I have a pile of books in front of me that I just pulled off the bookshelf. Jay, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here.
Professor of philosophy at my papers are falling all over here. At Talbot School of Theology, I took my MA in philosophy under J.P., and so did two others here on our staff, Greg Koukl, Melinda Penner. Actually, Melinda graduated first, and we are all benefiting. The reason I'm scrambling now is I just happened to, during the break, pull books off the shelf. Here's Christian Perspectives on Being Human, J.P. Moreland, Body and Soul, J.P. Moreland, Beyond Death, J.P. Moreland, The Life and Death Debate, J.P. Moreland, Scaling the Secular City. My first exposure to you, J.P., over at Simon Greenleaf University. Does God Exist, J.P. Moreland, Kai Nielsen. I mean, you're just, you've got Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview with William Lane Craig. You have made such an important contribution to the general field. I'm glad that you've come out with a kind of a handy-dandy
thank you.
Basic book on the soul.
That.
Yeah, and that's what we're discussing right now. Moody Press has published it. Now, what we've covered in the last hour, JP, is we've kind of laid a foundation for discussion about the nature of the soul. We talked about how critical it is in a physicalistic culture that has been dismissive of something everybody, by and large, took for granted for thousands of years because it just seems so obvious that we are a non-physical self that possesses a physical body. We talked about some of the terms, physicalism and dualism and substance dualism, and we talked about the nature of identity, which we're going to get to in just a little bit. We'll go back over that information because it's going to be important to make the philosophical case. But we did talk a little bit in the first segment, or the first hour together at the beginning of what seems to be a bit of an exodus of Christian theologians from the classical view of mind-body dualism. There is a mind and there is a body. There are two things that make a human being, and been drifting towards a physicalist explanation, and some of that is baptized, maybe I could say, in scriptural language and appeals. Let's talk about this for a little bit. I want you to talk about the biblical case now for the kind of dualism that you were talking about, that there is a self that's invisible, that possesses a body, and which in principle can survive the death of the body.
Right. Well, the Bible seems very, very clear that at death, the person leaves his body behind, and in the Old Testament went to an intermediate state before the final judgment. And in the New Testament, there is an intermediate state. We die, the soul leaves the body, we're still alive and conscious, but without a body, and then eventually at the end of the age, there will be the resurrection of the dead for everyone, and we will regain a body. So if there's an intermediate state like that, we can't be our bodies. Mm-hmm. And so Paul says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Mm-hmm. And he says that, it's possible for one to be found naked, meaning without a body. Mm-hmm. And he desires to be present with the Lord. And in one passage in 2 Corinthians 12, he says, I had an experience, and to be really honest with you, I don't know if I was in my body or not. Mm-hmm. Well, how could he be his body if he could possibly be outside of it? I mean, he wasn't thinking about his brain shooting out the top of his head and, traversing space. He was talking about his soul. Mm-hmm. Now, Jesus in Matthew 22 enters a debate between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Paul does the same thing toward the end of Acts. Mm-hmm. I can't remember. I think it's Acts 26, but 24, 26, can't remember off the top of my head. And the Sadducees did not believe that there was a soul that survived after death, and the Pharisees did. Jesus clearly sides with the Pharisees in that passage because he says, regarding the life after death, he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. In other words, he is right now the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because those three patriarchs are very alive right now.
Very present
but
for
we
him.
know where their bodies were. They were
Right.
in graves. Paul says, hey, the Sadducees are trying to nail me because I believe in a spirit and in disembodied existence. So these are clear texts that teach an intermediate state where there's life after death, before the re-embodiment.
You know, as I went through that section in the book, and then you have Old Testament material too, we'll talk about a little bit, it just strikes me that the biblical case, and folks, just keep in mind what we're arguing now is about what the Bible teaches, not that simply just because it teaches it, it's true. If you're a Christian and take the Bible as an authority, well, then that should be compelling.
Yes.
If you don't, then there's another approach that we'll take later to make the case for the soul. But it just strikes me that these passages are so univocal. They are so clear. They are so without alternate interpretation that it's hard for me to imagine how Christian scholars can disavow them, or at least the implications regarding the mind-body problem.
Well, you have to undergo a lot of mental gymnastics. But what you have to understand is that the people Jesus and Paul talked to in the Jewish territory were overwhelmingly influenced by the Pharisees' teaching, and the Pharisees were dualists. So they believed in a soul. There's no question about that. I think here's another problem, and even N.T. Wright is guilty of this, bless his heart. N.T. Wright, well-known New Testament scholar, said that the Bible...
Great scholar on the resurrection.
I respect him greatly.
Yes, right.
Says that the Bible knows nothing of dualism. Dualism is a pagan notion that has nothing to do with Christianity. Then he goes on, and he defends the idea that we could leave our bodies behind in the intermediate state and to be disembodied. Now you're thinking, what gives here?
Yeah.
And what gives is that Wright is not a philosopher, and he is confusing Platonic dualism with ordinary dualism. Platonic dualism is the view that not only do I have a soul, but my body's evil. When I die, I'll never have a body again because it was a prison house, and so on. And so he thinks that's dualism. So he says the Bible doesn't teach dualism, and he's right. If by dualism you mean Platonic dualism.
And this was the dualism that was destructive to Christian theology in the second century, the Gnostic dualism. Right. And we even see in some circles today implicitly that the flesh and the self are kind of equated. So anything physical, my body, it's not me, it's all the Lord, none of me kind of thing.
That's right.
And you see that, that little sense there. And he's right to reject that notion of Platonic or dualism.
He doesn't know there's another form of dualism that's not Platonic.
Now, I read that in the book, Jay, and I think you're right that he has made this mistake, but it just strikes me as so odd that a person with his education does not see the difference between these two types of dualism.
Well, they're just not educated in philosophy. You go into New Testament. This is why more and more New Testament and Old Testament scholars are abandoning dualism. Bruce Walke, who's an Old Testament scholar in the evangelical world, I studied under him at Dallas Seminary, says flat out, dualism is foreign to the Bible. But it's clear that dualism is taught in the Old Testament. What isn't taught is Platonic dualism.
Right.
But they don't make the distinction because they don't have the training requisite to make those kind of distinctions.
They only know of the one kind of dualism.
That's right.
And here, when God becomes a man, the incarnation is the best argument against that kind of Platonic dualism.
Matter can't be evil if God joined himself to it, can it?
Yeah. But we are talking about something different. And so when people read some of these other scholars, keep in mind that they are referring to a different kind of dualism. They're denying a kind of dualism that we deny as well.
Absolutely.
Without being aware of another type of dualism that's absolutely essential. Well, they are aware of it implicitly because they teach it, essentially, because it's taught in the Scriptures.
They just don't call it that.
Now, tell us some. We've got these statements in the New Testament that explicitly distinguish between the physical body
Yeah.
and the immaterial self.
Right.
We have New Testament's verses that talk about this intermediate state,
Right.
and we have statements like, the outer man is wasting away, the inner man is being grown. So these seem to be really obvious characterizations. The language of the New Testament, words for soul and spirit.
Yeah.
This helps as well. Can you say something about that?
Well, yes, it's very clear that there are times when the word psyche, soul, or the word for spirit, pneuma, in the New Testament, talk about the person that can leave the body. So Jesus, one of the ways that was described about dying in the Old Testament was the spirit left the body. So on the cross, Jesus says, "Into thy hands I commit my spirit." What he meant, if you take that just at obvious face value, what he meant was, I give my spirit, it will now leave into your hands. I'm coming to you, though my body will remain here on the cross. And so there would be a case where the word spirit clearly meant something that could leave the body. Now, when Jesus says to the thief on the cross, "Today you're going to be with me in paradise," he meant the word today. Some Christian materialists who read that try to say, well, what he was really saying to the thief on the cross is that it will seem to you like it's today because you're going to die today. You will go out of existence because you're your body, and since it's dead and deteriorating, you don't exist anymore. But thousands of years from now, at the resurrection, God's going to recreate you out of nothing. And so your next conscious moment will be in paradise. So it will seem to you, because you'll be unconscious during the intermediate period because you don't exist, it will seem to you like today. Now, I'm sitting
just
there
like
thinking,
when you fall asleep and wake up.
Yeah. You think Jesus is talking that way to the thief on the cross when he says today? He could have made that clear. He said, "Today you're going to be with me in paradise," and he meant it. You don't start fooling around when you're being executed.
That's right.
And undergoing severe pain. Please. I mean, that's just, you can prove anything you want in the Bible, Greg, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of people prove anything, and that's an example of it.
Yeah, just kind of read your own view into it, know, and you save your paradigm.
There you go.
With 1 foot on the dock and 1 on the boat, and you're going to end up in the drink if you're not careful. All right. Now, here's the splash I'm talking about, because when you said that, I thought to myself, all right, they are annihilated and recreated. In what sense is the thing that's recreated the same thing that was destroyed?
I have absolutely no idea, because it can't be the same particles, because,
They're
maybe somebody dies and their body deteriorates and their atoms get taken up into a tomato plant, and I eat the tomato plant. So we share particles.
Right.
So, I mean, honestly,
it could be a copy, but that's a copy. It's not the same.
I don't want a copy of me in the afterlife. I'd like to be there.
Yeah.
So I don't think there is a good answer to that question.
Now,
to be really candid with you.
But you used a phrase, though, so that would be an argument against that interpretation. But you used a phrase there that some Christian materialists. Now, this sounds to me like an oxymoron, and maybe some of our listeners like it's a contradiction in terms. So tell us about that phrase.
Well, they believe God's a spirit, but that's it. Some of these people, and I'm not going to mention names, don't believe in angels or a devil or demons. I know angels exist, and I know demons exist. I've had encounters with them. Well, first of all, the Bible teaches it.
Yes.
But it's been proven in my experience. I've seen them acting. But they don't believe in anything. They think so everything's physical outside of God. Now, God's spiritual. He's a spirit. But nothing else that's spiritual exists. But
it just... Again, it seems so contrary to the common biblical witness about the reality of an unseen world. This is what populates the biblical worldview. And for somebody then to claim I'm a Christian materialist, it seems to me there's got to be a lot of qualification of a lot of passages like the one you just offered
Greg,
needs to be made. Why not follow the path of least resistance here exegetically?
Well, 80% of the people all over the world believe in the soul. It's only Western intellectuals that don't. I had 2 students come from Africa, and they'd seen demons. The soul was just obvious to them in the Bible, and they couldn't understand how a person could be a Christian materialist. It really baffled them. And your point is that when they read the Bible, it just became obvious to them that there was a soul. Plus, they already knew there was a soul because they were aware of themselves.
Yeah, every single waking moment of their life.
Right.
My daughter, before I took this trip, I was talking to her a little bit about my preparation for this talk about atheism and naturalism, and my 9-year-old said, "What, Papa, why are there atheists?" And I said, well, because there are people who don't believe in things they can't see. And she said, well, can they see atoms? And I said, well, you're on the right track there, honey, but to be fair to them, they would say that they can detect atoms with scientific equipment, and they can't detect God that way, so they're not going to believe in something they can't detect with scientific instruments. And she paused for a moment and thought about that, and then she said, that's the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard.
Well, it is.
And it strikes me, innocence sees the obvious, and so the innocence, in a certain sense, the appropriate simple-mindedness of the average person allows them to see the obvious, while some intellectual has been convinced or argued out or trained out of seeing what's obvious. What about the notion, and we'll deal with this and then go to break, the objection that's raised, and I've heard this many times, that when you go to the Bible depicts a unity of the human being, and the notion of dualism, that there are 2 things going on here, is something out of Greek thought. And even if you don't take the Platonic dualism to the extreme that the Gnostics did and say matter is evil, still the notion that there are 2 things is something foreign, has been imported from Greek philosophy.
Yes, people all over the world, ever since the Neanderthals, believed in a soul different from the body that never heard of the Greeks. So the people in primitive China, India, all over the world, South America, there was an understanding that there was a soul that could leave the body at death, and the body was different. So while the Greeks did believe this was widely held, and the Greeks were just acknowledging what was obvious to everybody. So I don't agree with that, because it doesn't account. By the way, there have been studies that have demonstrated, as I mentioned earlier, that little children are naturally dualists. They don't have to be taught to be dualists. And they've never read Plato. And these little kids...
Well, they have a different Play-Doh.
Well, they have Play-Doh, but not Play-Doh, that's right. But they naturally find themselves distinguishing their mental life and themselves from their organs and the things you can see, their body. They don't need to be taught this. This has been demonstrated by studies.
It seems just because the Greeks and those following them took this to an illicit extreme does not mean that the basic notion of dualism isn't sound. And as you pointed out, even in the Old Testament, this idea of the self being distinct from the body in the intermediate stages is a foundational part of that worldview. I mean, the laws against necromancy, for example, you mentioned that.
Nice.
Go ahead and explain that to our listeners.
Oh, well, you were not supposed to communicate again with the dead. That's necromancy. Which assumes that the dead are still alive. Now, people knew their bodies weren't alive. So what was alive? It was their spirit. And so you have Saul conjuring up the prophet Samuel. Now, unless you think that's a silly little stupid story, I think it's important for people to know that these very kinds of things have happened today in other very primitive cultures. And that this is not something that just happened back then. There have been examples where people have communicated with the dead that are real, and they're documented. So the point is that by the Old Testament forbidding communicating with the dead, it's clear that the Old Testament thought you could communicate with the dead, which means that the Old Testament must have thought that a person was in his body because nobody went to the grave and tried to dig the body up to communicate with a person.
Well, I think the biblical case is really clear. When we come back, I want to venture into the philosophic case because one does not need the Bible to be able to make the case that there are souls and thus externally, so to speak, substantiate the biblical worldview. So we'll do that when we return with my guest, J.P. Moreland, the book, The Soul, How We Know It's Real and Why It Matters. I'm Greg Koukl, and this is Stand to Reason.
You can find STR on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, and Pinterest. Interact with STR staff, post comments, get involved with other like-minded Christians. Want to know what is going on with STR? Speaking events, new podcasts, resources, and articles? Follow STR online. You can find all of our social media connections at str.org.
Greg Koukl here, Stand to Reason. My guest, J.P. Moreland, Talbot Seminary, my mentor and instructor, philosopher. And we're talking about the existence of the soul and its significance and how to make the case for this thing that is one of the sine qua nons of Christianity, the things that without which Christianity is no longer Christianity, even though there are people in the current Christian community that take exception with the existence of the soul. We're trying to make the case that this is wrong-headed. Talked already about the biblical case, and this you document very thoroughly in the book, JP, so it's very accessible. Let's go into a little bit more difficult aspect. We're going to set the Bible aside for the moment. Having made the case biblically, now we are going to show that you can make the case without using the Bible, and this kind of helps show that the Bible matches up with the way the world really is.
That's right.
So it's a way of verifying what we believe, and also a way of appealing to those who may not, at least initially, take the Bible seriously.
Right.
So I want to talk about consciousness per se here for a bit, Jay, and let's just call consciousness our awareness of our own selves. Is that a fair way of putting it?
I think that's very much so.
Okay, it's our self. It's
what you're aware of when you introspect.
Yeah, there we go. And so, then the question is the self that we're aware of a purely physical thing, or is it a separate thing that is not physical? Is it not just a physical substance, but it's rather a non-physical substance? You may have a body, but do we have a mind too? And here I want to return to the law of identity and that notion that you introduced on our last hour together, and maybe you could just briefly reintroduce the notion and then show how this serves us to demonstrate that the self we're aware of is not something that's identical with something physical.
Well, if A is identical to B, that means A is the same thing as B. So whatever's true of A will be true of B because they're really the same thing.
Yeah, I don't think people shouldn't be thinking of identical twins now. That's not the sense we're using it. It's like Greg Koukl is identical to the president of Stand to Reason.
There you go. And so whatever's true of Greg Koukl will be true of the president and so on.
Right.
And if you can find one thing that's true of one that's not true of the other, they're not the same.
Right.
Now, that's important even if the two are correlated. They always go together. So fire and smoke may always go together, but that doesn't prove they're the same thing. Now, let me say why this is important. I was talking to one of the leading Christian physicalists in the world a few months ago. I'm not going to mention this person's name. But I said, why have you become a physicalist? And he said, the neuroscientific evidence is overwhelming. I said, would you mind telling me what that evidence is? Oh, he said, yeah. He said, we have discovered thousands of correlations between brain states and mental states. Now, and we're going to find more and more. And they're becoming more and more detailed. Now, I said, you're kidding me. That's your argument? And he said, yeah. And I said, correlation does not prove identity. And I want to explain this now before I go into this, because this is something I want your audience to really understand.
Yeah, this is central.
This is crucial. Now, there are these neurons called mirror neurons. A neuron is just a cell. It's a cell in the brain. And mirror neurons are certain kinds of cells in the brain that get activated when you do something like pick up a coffee cup. You pick up the coffee cup, certain mirror neurons start firing and get activated. Now, mirror neurons also get activated when you observe another person do the same thing. So if I see you pick up a coffee cup, those same mirror neurons will be activated. Now, some materialists have argued then that, and I think this is true, that mirror neurons are the basis of altruism. And here's their evidence for that. If a person has damaged mirror neurons, they have difficulty showing altruistic feelings to somebody else. Okay, let's grant that for the sake of argument. What is supposed to follow from that? There are three interpretations of that information that are consistent with the neuroscientific fact. Of what is the neuroscientific fact? That if your mirror neurons are damaged, it's hard to express feelings of empathy toward others. Okay, here's one interpretation of that data. A feeling of empathy is identical to or is the same thing as the firing of those mirror neurons. That's number one.
That would be the physicalist
That would be
view.
the physicalist.
Right.
Number two is the property dualist. The firing of mirror neurons causes a feeling of empathy in the brain. That feeling of empathy is a non-physical state, but it's caused by the physical state. And if that physical state doesn't work, it won't cause the mental state of a feeling of empathy. That would be property dualism.
And that's consistent with the evidence.
Yeah. The third theory that's consistent with the evidence is substance dualism, according to which if the mirror neurons in your brain don't work, then your soul depends on the brain working, just like it depends on your eyeballs working to see. You poke my eyes out, and my ego won't be able to see, and if you shut off my mirror neurons, I won't be able to feel empathy, but the feeling of empathy is a mental state in the soul, and the mirror neurons are in the brain. That's substance dualism. Now, here's the point. The scientific evidence is consistent with all three of those. So that, and that's what happens in all of these neuroscientific discoveries. They show correlations or dependency relationships. In other words, if a certain part of the brain doesn't work, like in Alzheimer's disease, a certain mental thing can't happen. That is consistent with all three views. So this debate is not a scientific debate. It's philosophical and theological.
So when he says that the scientific evidence is overwhelming, your point is that the scientific evidence does not make the case for the physicalist view in any way, shape, or form.
We all believe in correlations.
Yes.
Good Lord, I believe that when I'm thinking about lunch, there's something going on in my brain that correlates with it. I mean, do you think that my brain pops out of existence when I'm thinking about lunch? Something's going on in my brain, and the two are related, but they're not the same thing. That's the point.
And that's where the law of identity comes in, and the whole discussion about that. If you find characteristics of your mental life that do not have the qualities of physical things, then they are not physical things.
Yeah, let me give you an example. A thought is a mental state, and it can be true or false. But no state of my brain can be true or false. It makes no sense to look at a state of my brain that's being activated while I'm having a thought, and it's projected on a computer screen, and somebody pointing to that state of the brain and say, look at that state of the brain near the left hemisphere. It's true. States of the brain aren't true or false. Another example, thoughts don't have geometrical properties. They don't have size, shape, or location. I mean, my thought of lunch isn't twice as big as my thought of breakfast. It's not shaped like a square or a circle, and it's not located anywhere. It's not closer to my left ear or my right ear.
It's not governed by the laws of physics.
That's going on while I'm having the thought you can actually observe and print out and project on a computer screen, and it does have geometrical properties.
You know, one of the things that was so impressive to me when I first learned about this is that when they try to make correlations between thoughts and brain states, they always have to have the patient report.
Oh, yeah.
To explain that, the
Well,
notion of the privacy, first-person private.
Oh, Greg, you're so right. We know that rapid eye movement means you're dreaming, but the question is, how do we know that? Well, we had to wake people up when their eyes were moving and ask them, was anything going on? And they said, yeah, I was dreaming. Now, why did we have to wake people up? Because after all, when the people were asleep, they had monitors on their brain, and they knew in complete detail what was happening in terms of the firing and the waves that were being emitted by the brain and so on. So they had complete knowledge of what was happening in the brain while the eyes were moving. If they had complete knowledge of the brain, and if a dream is just a state of the brain, why didn't they know they were dreaming? The answer is a dream is a state, a mental state in the soul that the science couldn't see. He didn't have access to it.
Right.
So he had to wake the patient up, and he had to tell him what was going on inside of them, because the scientist only had access to the brain. He did not have access to the soul of the mind.
And this is what we call a first-person private perspective.
There you have it right there.
Which is unique to the soul. I mean,
if
the soul is physical, if we are all physical, we all have, in principle, equal access to physical things.
Oh, well, an electron doesn't have first-person private access to itself.
Right.
Great.
Yeah. Now, you had given an illustration once before that I thought was really helpful. I think it was you. When people are asking, because they're confused, they're thinking, wait a minute, but if this section of my brain is damaged, then I can't function. So doesn't that support the notion of physicalism? And I think you used an illustration, something about like a person welded into a car.
Yeah.
Go ahead with that.
Suppose that I was forced to get in the driver's seat of a car. They buckled the seatbelt and locked it so I couldn't get out of the driver's seat, and closed and locked all the doors. But there was gas in the tank. I could still get around town by driving the car. But now what if something happened to the steering mechanism so the car would only turn left instead of right? That would limit my ability to do things, but it wouldn't prove that I was the car. Now what would happen if the car had such a complete shutdown that the engine broke and the car couldn't move? That would prove I was the car. All that shows is that while I'm in the car, I'm dependent on the parts of the car working before I can do things. And if I could get out of the car, then a broken car would not affect me. And in near-death experiences, for example, there are people who
get out of the car.
One guy died. He woke up. He didn't know he was dead. He thought he just sat up in his hospital room and was waiting his operation, which had already happened. He looked over to the right of him and saw a body on a table, and it was his body. And a nurse came in and took his false teeth and put it across the room in a specific drawer. Well, he went into a coma for 7 days, and it just so happened, day 7, the nurse that took his false teeth happened to be on duty that day. She hadn't been on duty the earlier part of the week. He woke up. He said, "You were there when I died." And she said, "How do you know that?" He said, "You put my false teeth over there in that drawer, and they're right over there." And she just about wet her pants, because, I mean, that was exactly what happened. Now, here you have a guy outside the car. When he was in his car, things weren't working. So the point is that when I'm in my body, I need my organs to work. If my eyeballs don't work, I can't see. If there's a problem with my ears, I can't hear. If there's a problem with my brain, I can't recall memories or think very well. But that doesn't prove that my thoughts are in my brain or that I am my brain. All that shows is that I depend on my brain when I'm in my body. By the way, the brain depends on your mind, too, because, like I said, one of the most important things in cognitive behavioral therapy is the idea that when you learn to spot your negative thoughts, you can regroove your brain by shifting to thinking positive thoughts, and that the content of your thoughts will literally dig new neural pathways in your brain that they have been able to, on a scan, they've been able to observe the change of the brain from simply changing your thought content.
Well, not only that, but another kind of obvious sense of dependency is a body without a soul is called a corpse.
Absolutely.
So that the dependency goes both ways. Now, I want our listeners to be clear on when you're talking about NDEs, near-death experiences, what we've established so far is nothing about life after death. That's further on in the discussion. But what these near-death experiences, this remote viewing, like the man seeing the nurse take his teeth, what it shows is that the man is not his body.
Exactly. That's
because
the point.
His body is over there. Now, more could be done with this, and I just want to draw attention to
that's right.
your book with Gary Habermas called Beyond Death, Exploring the Evidence for Immortality, because there's a lot of detail about NDEs that you guys cover in there, more information about the soul. So this is just another excellent resource that they can go to. What I want to talk about in the next segment, it'll be our final segment, JP, is I want to talk about now more... I always hate saying practical application, as if the last hour and a half have not been immensely practical.
Let's
it has
been.
But let's talk about the personal significance.
Yes, let's do that.
And spiritual formation and those kinds of things, given the reality of the soul, the biblical evidence that we can demonstrate that souls exist even without the scriptures. And we've just touched on that a little bit this segment, but there's so much more in the book.
Well, the book goes, yes, that's right.
And,
let's do it when we get back.
And we'll do that in our final segment together with J.P. Moreland, my guest, the book, The Soul, How We Know It's Real and Why It Matters. Greg Koukl for Stand to Reason.
At Stand to Reason, we depend on the support of donors to carry on our mission to equip Christian ambassadors, and your non-cash donation items can help. You can transform your old cars, cell phones, or other items into ministry impact by donating them to Stand to Reason. Think of it. Because of your donation, Christians just like you will be able to effectively share their faith and change the lives of others forever. To make non-cash donations of all kinds to Stand to Reason, call iDonate at 877-897-4273 or go to idonate.com and visit STR's page. They'll take care of everything for you and Stand to Reason. Just call them at 877-897-4273 or visit idonate.com. Thank you very much for making Stand to Reason's work possible.
Final segment here on Stand to Reason with Dr. J.P. Moreland talking about the soul. And boy, Jay, there are so many things that we could continue to explore. But your book kind of closes talking about the soul in this very personal way and all of the issues that are ethical and moral and spiritual that are relevant to this discussion, and sometimes we have to do the work of getting people to take the issue seriously before we can then talk about why it's important. But so let's talk about that a little bit. For you, in practical terms, maybe we could call it spiritual formation or spiritual development as a disciple of Christ. Tell me what your conviction of the reality of the soul, how that informs your Christian walk.
Well, it's made a huge difference for me, Greg, because since I know that I'm a soul and not my body or brain, that means that I have the power to rise above it and not be enslaved by it. And let me say to begin with that since I do have a body, caring for my body is important to my mental and spiritual health. So I'm for antidepressant medication. I'm for taking omega-3 fatty acid, for exercise. I mean, all of that's important because the brain and the body do affect your mood. But one of the most important things that has been discovered in psychology, which really just matches what the Bible taught years and years ago, is that one of the keys to overcoming anxiety and depression is learning to spot negative self-talk. And when you're talking to yourself like, oh gosh, things are going to get worse in the next week, or I've got this meeting in 2 weeks with the boss and I just know what if it doesn't go well? Or ruminating on your past failures. So you're engaged in negative self-talk. You have the freedom of will to stop that and to say, wait a minute. I'm talking to myself this way. That's not true. I don't have any reason to believe that's true. I'm going to replace that with a positive thought. By the way, and this is why scripture memory has been so important to me. I don't mean memorizing necessarily whole books of the Bible, though that's a good idea, but memorizing 4 or 5 or 6 passages that are very nourishing to you, because you take that negative talk, you spot it, you challenge it, and replace it with a positive thought, like a text. I will never leave you, and I will never forsake you, because I am your God in the Old Testament. So the Bible says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. And what we're discovering is that is more true than anybody ever knew, that your thoughts are the number one triggers to your emotions. And negative emotions are ultimately triggered in most cases by negative thoughts. Well, because I'm a soul, I'm not enslaved to my brain. If I were just my brain, I'd be a passive bystander waiting to see what happened.
Right.
But I have the power to transcend my brain and through practice use my thoughts and my beliefs to alter my habit of going negative. And that will, over time, improve my mood.
Yeah, by the way, that liability applies for either physicalism or property dualism, because in property dualism, your mental states are not physical, but it's bottom up. You're along for the ride. You're not in control.
That's right.
But if substance dualism is true, if you are a soul that has a body, then you're in charge. Largely.
Absolutely.
You can make decisions. You can start, change. You can change things. You can cause things to take place.
That's right.
Yeah.
Also, my body can engage in causal relations with objects around me, and all I mean by that is my body can cause the lamp to fall over if I push it. Or a rock can cause me to fall down if it hits my body. Okay, fair enough. I engage in physical causal relations with things outside me that are physical. But I also have the power to engage in prayer and expressions of affection with God who's not physical. Now, when I do that, I'm not engaging in some kind of physical causal relationship with a Mormon deity up there that's got a body. I'm engaging in a distinctive spiritual activity where I'm directing my soul and its state of affection or need, if as the case may be, toward an immaterial being who is listening to me. So that the interaction with the spiritual world becomes even more real, because that interaction isn't physical. It's a spiritual interaction. And since there's more to me than my body, I can do that. I can engage in those spiritual interactions.
When I was talking to my daughter a couple of days ago on our hike, I think I mentioned that last hour, and I was trying to pass on some of these notions about the growth of the soul, and how, and maybe you can speak about this a little bit, about how a major purpose of our life on this earth, in this tent, so to speak, which is another reference to dualism, by the way, is so that our souls will grow for eternity. That I told Annabeth, I said, honey, the things that you do with God that causes your soul to grow will benefit you forever. I'm thinking of the Timothy passage where Paul says that Physical exercise profits a little, but godliness is a means of
Yeah.
great gain, for it holds a promise not only for this life, but
Yes.
also for the life to come.
Well, absolutely. And when we talk about growing the soul, obviously, we don't mean that our soul could get overweight someday.
Mm-hmm.
So my soul doesn't become, 20 feet long instead of 10 feet. But what we mean is that it's actually growing in the sense that we're giving it more truth. We're cultivating better desires and feelings. And as the more we learn and the more we learn to feel and desire the right things, our souls become larger. And that's why being a lifelong learner is such an important thing, because your soul can stagnate if you're not continuing to receive input and to interact with truth but falsehood and try to understand it and analyze it. And that's how souls grow. And we've all met people that are big. We call them big-hearted and big-minded, and they're good people. And it's because they know a lot, and they have compassionate hearts. But
They have
that
large
doesn't
souls.
and they cultivated that.
Right. When I think about just the problem of evil, for example, which is a huge issue for those defending the faith.
Yeah.
The soul-making theodicy, the idea that whatever else may be involved with the problem of evil, there are opportunities that evil provides an opportunity for our souls to grow in a way that they wouldn't grow otherwise.
That's absolutely true. I've experienced it myself.
Yeah, and looking back, and I know most people would say they don't, as you did earlier, I don't want to go through that again, but having gone through it, I see that what I have now is so much better than what I had before. And again, one of the legacies that you have in my own life is a tendency more and more to see life in that sense, not in this temporal sense. And this is back to momentary light affliction, is producing for us an eternal weight of glory.
Exactly right.
Wanting to see that weight of glory, manifest and produced in my life through these events. So I'm less likely now to ask, why are you doing this, Lord? And more likely to try to cooperate with whatever it is God wants to use this for my soul. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I know that people are asking this question, so it might be a good time to touch base on it, and you do have 4 or 5 pages in your book about it. Animal souls.
Mm-hmm. Well, a soul, remember, is something that has consciousness and animates the body. And animals have a unified conscious field. That is, they're not just a bunch of little pieces of consciousness strung throughout a brain, but when an animal looks at a field, they have one single visual awareness of the whole field. Mm-hmm. And the soul is what contains the animal's consciousness. Now, I'm open to arguments that animals go to heaven. I'm kind of disinclined at this point to believe that, but it's not something I've studied, so I'm kind of an amateur on that question.
Well, the question does for me. It seems to take away some of the uniqueness of being human and in God's eyes. And I've told my daughter, and again, I could be wrong in this, but heaven is a place for special creatures. Human beings in relationship with God. It's not a place for these other.
Well, that's been my inclination as well. Animal souls, I believe, most likely cease to exist when the animal dies. Mm-hmm. And the animal soul is not anywhere near, it's not made in the image of God, it's not anywhere near as complicated as the human soul. Mm-hmm. There are so many things animals can't do with their minds and so on. They're just very simple creatures. Mm-hmm. Some are more complicated. Dogs are more complicated than goldfish or earthworms. Mm-hmm. But by and large, the animal souls are very, very simply put together. But if an animal didn't have a soul, it would be a zombie. It would just be a robot, a mechanical machine without any consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't have sensations or thoughts or beliefs or desire. Now, these are 5 things that you've identified in the book as characteristics of soul: sensations, thoughts, beliefs, desires, acts of will.
Right.
I have a question about this use, and it does seem clearly animals have some of these, and these are
Right.
characteristic of souls, so they have souls. Apart from the biblical record that seems to indicate that animals have souls,
Yes.
um, the difference is they don't have the same kinds of souls that we have.
Right.
But you mentioned that thoughts are the kinds of things that can be put into a sentence. And here's my question about that. If thoughts are are defined as propositional content that could be put into a sentence, that means that things without language don't have thoughts.
Yes. Well,
And if you don't have thoughts before
yes.
you have language, how do you acquire language without having thoughts?
Yeah, you have to be able to have thoughts without language. And so a thought is the kind of thing that can be put into language, but it doesn't need to be.
Okay, good. Well, that's a clarification
Yeah.
then. That helps me because
No, you're absolutely right.
clearly, you look at a dog and he goes, look, is that bowl of food and that bowl of
Yep.
food, and you can see there he's trying to make a decision. I don't know about earthworms,
Right.
Except for the one that I put on my hook last
Yeah.
week when I was fishing. It's trying to get away from that hook. But
Yeah, that was one that had a thought.
yeah. What are, just in the final few minutes here, Jay? What are the thoughts that you want the dear souls who are listening to this show to take away?
Well,
if they only remember one thing from this discussion, or maybe two, what are the kinds of things that you'd like to have them to?
The most important thing that I want to say to my brothers and sisters is that do your best to continue to believe the Bible stronger and stronger the older you get. Don't be bullied by things you hear on the news or you read in Time or Newsweek magazine that sounds like if it were true, it would undermine what we believe. And don't revise your views to make them palatable with modern sensibilities.
Mm-hmm.
Stick with what we've believed for centuries. You don't have to be able to defend it. I mean, I would hope that our audience would want to learn to do better at that. You don't have to be an expert. There are people in our body of Christ that do that work for us. But stick with your guns. Mm-hmm. The second thing is to remember that you're not your body. Now, your body's very important. You want to take care of it, and it affects you. But there's more to you than your body, and cultivating your inner life is more important than cultivating your abs. Mm-hmm. So, it's good to be in shape. I exercise, but you want to build your mind and your emotions, and that's what matters.
Mm-hmm. I want to emphasize too that, and maybe this goes without saying, but so some people don't misunderstand when you say stick to what Christians have believed for centuries and what the Bible teaches. This isn't obscurantist. It isn't like close your eyes, close your ears, just block. The fact is what Christians have believed for centuries. We believe for very good reasons and very powerful arguments, and coming from very capable Christian thinkers have demonstrated these things to be reasonable. And in fact, as you pointed out, Jay, the current trends are so counterintuitive. It's hard to imagine how people can actually believe these things. There's some citation from I don't know if it was H.G. Wells or somebody to the effect that that must have been thought of by an intellectual, because no ordinary person could be that dumb.
I think there you have it right there.
Yeah. So we're not talking about ignoring.
No.
We're talking about ordinary common sense and what Christians have defended adequately for a long time.
Right.
And don't be taken with the fashion of people who say ridiculous things. But the other thing about cultivating the soul through learning and memorization and obedience. I mean, I got 60 seconds. Can you give me just a couple of things that you do specifically to cultivate? You talked about memorization of Scripture and sticking with Scripture.
Yeah, I've also talked about being very diligent and paying attention to my thoughts and trying to bring them captive. And what I mean by that is that if I find myself thinking thoughts that are going to make me negative or something, I catch them and I replace them with other kinds of thoughts
that are true.
I also try to, in the morning, center myself before the Lord and just be quiet for a period of time, so that I can achieve a state of peace and calm before the Lord as I approach my day. And I've practiced trying to find that place before His presence where I can not as easily be moved from it as I get older.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not perfect in that, but I'm making some progress in it, and those are things that I do.
Jay, thank you so much
Oh,
for the
what a privilege.
Well, the role that you've had in my life, just that enough. I just can't thank you enough for that. And of course, it's been bearing fruit in the lives of others and multi-generations here. But all that you've done for the body of Christ, you've been a dear friend and a great mentor, and
Thank
I
you,
thank
my
you.
friend.
J.P. Moreland, Talbot Seminary. I hope many of you get a chance to attend that program and be part of what they're doing over there. The book, once again, The Soul, How We Know It's Real and Why It Matters. J.P. Moreland and Moody Press. Get it at str.org. Thank you, friends, for joining us, and give them heaven this week, all right? Bye-bye now.